Hi everyone, my name is Dave Gray. As some of you know, I'm working on a book called Principles of Agility for Rosenfeld Media, and I've been interviewing people from all different kinds of professions, from firefighters to law enforcement to software developers. And today I'm very excited to be talking to my friend Michael Gold, who's a jazz musician and also, I guess, at some level a business consultant. He does workshops helping people do apply principles of jazz to business. But today we're here to talk about jazz. So welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Dave.
It's good to see you. So let's just start by, can you just start by telling me how'd you get into jazz in the first place? Tell us about your journey.
Well, I think the first thing I would say this way. So that really is what got me into the journey. I grew up in the Hudson Valley in New York State, late 60s, early 70s, and the music in that area was really rich. And I was very impacted by the bass. I used to go to hear the band, for those of you old enough to remember, Bob Dylan's band. I took them in really intimate environments, and there was something fundamentally unifying about the bass player's role in the ensemble. And clearly it was, for me, it was the heartbeat of that music. And it just mesmerized me. So I started out playing blues, some rock and roll, moved into bluegrass music, actually, which was very big in the Hudson Valley in that time frame. Pete Seeger's from that area, Levon Helm, Jay Unger, Molly Mason, all sorts of great music going on. And I became a good bluegrass bass player. I was touring nationally with a band called Country Cooking right out of high school. And then I started getting somewhat claustrophobic in terms of the role that the bass and bluegrass played. And at the same time, somebody gave me a record by Charlie Parker, which absolutely blew my mind. I mean, I couldn't believe that this language was so powerful and there and improvised. That's what was astounding to me.
So talk to me a little bit about that. You just used a couple words. You said you were starting to feel claustrophobic.
Yeah. Well, in bluegrass music, the bass plays a very, very specific role. It plays on the first beat and the third beat of the measure. And without getting too technical, the first beat and the third beat of the measure are very predictable. That's sort of march time music. The difference between jazz and music that is delineated on the first and third beat, the important beats in jazz come on the second and the fourth beat, which are basically considered by some to be unstable, and yet it's really what gives it its propulsion, its sense of surprise, its capacity to really use to explore different ideas. Putting the emphasis on those two beats really changes things. And so I was claustrophobic because as a bluegrass bass player, I had to stay very locked into that one 3 with very specific notes, and I really didn't have a lot of freedom. And at that age, I wanted more. I really needed more freedom. I needed more of a scope of possibility. So I moved into jazz. I actually stopped playing the bass for a little while and started playing the alto saxophone, and then picked up the bass again and began to study it seriously in college. I studied with some very good bass players, Chuck Israels, and some classical players.
Let me ask you a little bit about. You said that a lot of people feel that the second and fourth beat are unstable.
Mm.
You could talk a little bit about. You said here are the words that I marked. You said unstable. A lot of people think of it as unstable, but that's what gives jazz its propulsion, its surprise, and ability to explore. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, why would I guess I can intellectually, in an abstract way, I can understand why something being unstable would give it movement and surprise. But maybe can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, again, it's really relative because we're talking about music in the American culture where the institution of the norm, which was, if you go back to music before, popular music before the 1920s, say, very much about a predictable structure where people knew what to expect, and their expectations were never disrupted, or if they were, it was done in ways that were mildly surprising. And really, I mean, with the explosion of jazz in the early part of the century, jazz represented a lot of things, but one of the things that really disrupted the apple cart, so to speak, the paradigm of music, was shifting the beat from the downbeat, the 1 and the 3, to the 2 and the 4, which in cultures like the African culture, where rhythmic traditions were much more complex, that was actually a norm and very much a part of their culture. But in this culture, it wasn't. And so
why would something that seems as simple as shifting a beat just by one tap of the foot, like, just why would something that seems to me so simple, and I'm not a musical person really, at least not in any technical way, why would something like that create so much change and opportunity? Sounds so simple.
Wow, that's it. Yeah. Well, and that's a really simple question, except the answer is very complex. It really has to do. Okay, I think if you back out of it and you talk about cultural norms, if a culture's norms are very much based on certain fundamental expectations, and when we're talking about, march time, 1, 2, 3, 4, dot, 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 dot. I mean, that's just driven in to the culture, decade, century, so that it's deeply expected. It's in the psyche, and one of the things that music does is it plays with expectation. So even in classical music, if you get into analyzing why something is, why did Stravinsky's Rite of Spring actually cause riots when it was first performed in the early part of the century? The audience rioted. They violently reacted to it because it destroyed the norms in such dramatic fashion, rhythmically, tonally, and it really challenged people with things that just rocked their boat. So and Stravinsky was drawing on the world of jazz very heavily. He
Well,
he
there's
was
a thing in you started out by saying that the answer is complex, and there is a thing in complexity science where they talk about very small changes in the initial conditions can create lots of differentiation in the way that things change. The whole, I mean, sometimes called the butterfly effect, where, but the idea is that is not that small moves make big things happen, but they can create a lot of variation in what happens. So that small and simple rules often give rise to complexity.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering, you're it sounds like you're saying that part of what happened was there was an expectation that had been built up over many years about what something is going to sound, what when you listen to music, what it's supposed to sound like.
Mhm.
And jazz, in a way, was a reaction to that, or a.
Well, it, okay, it was, if we're talking about the actual music, um, uh, what was going on in the actual music. But let's back out of it for a second and realize that jazz really was the first instance of true globalization that happened here in this culture. Um, from a popular point of view, because what it was doing was fusing very, very different musical traditions from the African culture, which had come here through the slave trade, and um, fusing that with the very, very um, carefully structured paradigm of musical composition that was Western European. Um, so a couple of things were happening. The traditions from Africa were improvised. The traditions from Western Europe were very much not improvised. It was totally about structure, and when musicians played music, they were essentially following directions on a piece of paper. The freedom in Western European music was in the hands of the composer,
Mhm.
which was probably in most cases dead for centuries before the music was even played. Um, but the act of performance, from the public's point of view, never involved improvisation. And improvisation coming to our culture through this music was really quite a new idea. Uh, I am stepping out of my boundaries a little bit to talk about um, stepping out of my expertise a little bit to talk about the nature of improvisation in African traditions. Um, but I believe that the rhythmic structures were such that they did two things. They afforded a lot of freedom to the individual. At the same time, they provided a very flexible and agile structure, not only for that individual, but for the group of musicians, and because the music really was a part of social life, it was very tied into the society and the culture itself. Um, so the structures, the musical structures that came from Africa were of a very different nature than the Western European ones, um, uh, equally as potent. And when they were combined, you essentially had the capacity to innovate using a very complex technology of music theory and structure. Um, and this literally exploded with jazz, which, if you look at the complexity of the development and the pace at which it developed, I mean, it's really unprecedented. From 1915 until 1950, you go from Scott Joplin, really at the turn of the century, all the way to Miles Davis and Wayne Shorter, Charlie Parker. Huge um, arc of complex development and styles, and we don't even get into what it spawned, which was a multi-billion-dollar industry of rock and roll, which to this day just keeps, producing and producing. So
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. And I mean, one of what I understand, what I hear you saying is that it was the real Big Bang, if you will, is where this highly structured kind of technology, or this highly structured way of working was melded with this highly improvisational way of working. And so I mean, I think a lot of people think of jazz as improvisation, and they don't necessarily think of the structural side of it. Maybe a lot of people who are not jazz players, but and there's a lot of conversation in business today about, wow, we're moving away from hierarchies and we're moving to more fluid, networked things. But I think there's something interesting in what you're saying, is it's not about one or the other. It's about the magic of jazz is of what happens when they come together.
Well, let me respond to the first thing you said, which, a lot of folks do think that, because there's often a lot of chaos or dissonance, almost seems as if people are making it up as they go along, but in fact, jazz is all about structure. The great jazz bass player Charles Mingus once made a comment to a journalist. He said, "Man, you can't improvise on nothing." When the journalist, which is true. I mean, you can't. And so the idea of jazz is that not only does it liberate the individual, but the individual is liberating the structure as well. And not only is it a one-to-one thing, it's a collaborative act that's happening, which really is where the joy and the exuberance comes when the group is right, when the chemistry is right, when people are really listening, because there's this collaborative liberation of the individual, the group, and it's all in application to the structure that you're working with. So if let's say we're playing a tune, Bye Bye Blackbird, most people know that tune. Ba-da-da-ba-bee-ba-ba, you know that. That's the structure. That's what we're all agreeing upon. We may never even play the melody, and yet, because we know the structure and we each know it and are completely responsible for it, we're dancing with that. We're dancing with it together, and we're opening it up. We're using it as a launch pad, a point of departure, finding all sorts of ideas that work, agreeing on them or maybe disagreeing on them. And it's that act of exploration that really is what people hear and term improvisation. There are a lot of different ways to do it, so you can't really point to one and say this is jazz, or this is jazz, or this is improvisation. But improvisation is, to my way of thinking, very much about structure.
So how do you, I mean, so you talked about agreeing and disagreeing and exploring and using a structure as a point of departure. That sounds a lot like a conversation.
It is. It is. One of the things that jazz did, hang on one second. I was always struck by, as I studied jazz, and I began to realize that, I've got to learn the same thing the composer knows. I've got to be responsible for those compositional techniques and ideas. I've got to understand what the conductor knows in terms of listening to the other people in the ensemble, because there's no conductor. We're conducting ourselves. Um, and I have to be completely responsible for my instrument and my ability to play it, which really are three different roles that in the purely classical world of Western European music, we're all very separated. Uh, Jazz takes these roles and fuses them together. Um, so, are we going to create music of the level of a Mozart string quartet or a Beethoven, small chamber piece? Absolutely not. That's that's not the point. What jazz is doing is it's evolving the use of music from a very balkanized process where the conductor, the composer sort of did research and development, maybe sometimes for years before he actually wrote the piece. And then it got given to the conductor who would arrange it for an orchestra, and eventually it would all be performed in a very siloed way. Jazz takes all of that and rapidly evolves it into a almost a conversation, not almost, a conversational language that um, it strikes me that before, if you ever look at the Louis Armstrong Hot Five, you can see this wonderful photograph of their ensemble in the I think it was 1920s sometime, and there all of a sudden is this new idea, which is a small group of people, an ensemble improvising together, without a conductor, without a formal score. Every time they play, they're coming up with something new, and they're doing it in collaboration with each other. This just had never existed. Um, Last night, I had the great pleasure of watching a documentary called Muscle Shoals, which talks about a recording studio in Alabama that was responsible for unbelievable number of the hits that came out. Aretha Franklin, Percy Sledge, just everybody. And the group of musicians that were behind this, which was this small ensemble of improvisers that were just churning out great ideas. So it really became this crucible of ideas, and the reason it worked that way is because the language of music had been, for lack of a better term, democratized. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you can use it. You can use it. You can improvise with it. You don't have to. You don't have to formally sit there and write down scores. You know.
So let's talk about leadership. I mean, how does leadership work in a jazz quintet, say? Is there no leader, or does leadership move around? Or how how do five people collaborate in real time? Is there a leader? Is there no leader?
Uh,
I'm a basketball player, so I can picture a basketball team playing, and in a basketball team, there is no leader. There is structure, and part of the structure, part of the improvisation comes in about in the competition with another team. You're both trying to move the ball in opposite directions, and you have a goal.
mhm.
How would you describe that dynamic in a jazz
Good. Good. Okay.
ensemble?
Well, uh, I would say first of all that leadership is decentralized and it's distributed in jazz, both. Um, if you think of the different instruments in the ensemble, some of them are clearly more suited for supporting roles. The drums and the bass are typically called the rhythm section. And they create an infrastructure, a rhythmic and harmonic infrastructure that supports everything else that's happening on top of it. And to a great extent, they have less freedom to really turn the tune inside out, and yet at the same time they are improvising. So because we're not reading notes, when I walk a bass line, I know what the structure is that I'm reflecting, but the actual notes that I'm choosing are improvised. The feeling that I'm producing is very much improvised. It's all about flow and listening and integrating and reflecting what else is going on in the ensemble. And to that extent, the relationship between the drummer and the bass player is really what's going on in the ensemble. And as adventurous or flamboyant or charismatic as the soloist, the trumpet player, or even the piano player might be,
or the sax,
they're beholden to what's going on in that infrastructure, which to me is really what leadership is all about. So in jazz, even though the bass and the drums are part of that supporting function, we have to be able to solo. We have to be able to take that limelight where the sax player is finished, piano player is finished. We'll get a space to express our ideas with as much freedom as each of those others have. Generally speaking, much shorter in duration, because the nature of the instrument is such that it really isn't built to solo all the time. And yet, it's absolutely critical that I understand experientially what it means to take that leadership role. If I don't understand that, then the kind of support that I'm providing for the improvisation of the leader, the trumpet player or the sax player, is one step removed from what they really need. If I know what it means to be in that space, I know how to provide that support in a much more effective way. And I also know how to go out on the limb with them, stay close enough to where they are really going out on the edge without losing the support that they need. Versus, let's say, a bass player who doesn't solo or never learned to solo would be very uncomfortable if that particular soloist really started taking chances, because it would threaten their understanding of what their role is. So,
well, how do you get there? I mean, people have to start somewhere, right? So, how do you move from? I mean, you must have had a time in your life where you were not comfortable soloing, right? Where
last night. Oh man, one thing's for sure. You know, if you're gonna try to hold on to certainty and staying comfortable, you don't want to play jazz. And that's not to say that jazz has to be uncomfortable, but you've got to be able to look at uncertainty and vulnerability as conditions that are not to be feared, but rather to be recognized as important as part of the ecological balance of trying to innovate. Some of my colleagues would argue with me that jazz is about innovation, but I feel that it is. And then we get into a question of what is innovation. So I'll just say that jazz is innovation in the sense that we are constantly tinkering with our own growth and understanding and our own capacity to create. There's a very interesting article I just read this morning by Jill Lepore in the New Yorker that really takes Clayton Christensen's theories of innovation to task. And at a certain point, she suggests that, you know, innovation really is about very, very incremental change versus massive disruption. And I would have to say that that's what I mean when I say jazz is innovative. Every night when we get up on that stand and we may be playing the same tune again, we played it 3 nights in a row, it's going to be different. And it's up to us to know as individuals where that envelope was the night before and how we push it very slightly again the next night to really build on what we understand, but not to fall back on something that is so safe that there's no uncertainty about it.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me. Again, I'm interested in complexity theory. I'm not a complexity scientist myself, but I think I don't know what the name of this concept is, but there is an idea in complexity science that incremental changes can actually lead to big cascading events. And the example I think from John Holland is this idea of a sand pile. You can just keep adding grains of sand. And you keep adding grains of sand, and it gets higher and higher and higher. But at certain points, it'll reach a point where it just. And the same thing is the case with earthquakes. You know that you have tectonic plates that are just moving incrementally along each other all the time. It's all the time, and then earthquakes happen. And you know these things. There's something about the scale of these events that I believe is like a sort of along a power law. You know that most of the time. These things are small, but occasionally, they can be very, very big, very big. And so I wonder if, just going back to this idea of uncertainty and being able to constantly tinker with stuff. You mentioned earlier you said you agree you could be in a musical space. You can agree and you could disagree. How do you know? How do you know when someone disagrees with you in a jazz when you're playing jazz?
Great question. Well, there are various types of disagreement. There's in jazz, what we're after is a flow state, and when I say that, I mean a sense of momentum in which everybody is feeling that they are moving at the peak of their capability, and nothing is really holding them back. And that essentially has to do with everybody feeling the pulse, the time, in a way that's integrated. It doesn't mean everybody has to feel it the same way, but it does mean that everybody has to have a certain level of responsibility for it, so that, let's say, the bass player isn't slowing down and pulling everybody down, or the drummer isn't rushing and creating an anxiety that other people may not find they want to feel. So it really boils down to the capacity to listen in a very deep way. But there is a friction that is very desirable, that can even propel swinging to a higher level when there's a very diverse way that each person comes to the time. Now, with students, I like to say that, all right, most students will come in and they'll want to play a million notes and be, as pyrotechnical as they can. And I say, wait a minute. Let's just talk about the pulse, right? We've got to agree on that before we can do anything. And the interesting thing about this pulse, there is an absolute center to each one of these beats, dead center. But then there's also thinking about these beats on the front slightly before it actually happens. And then there's also thinking about these beats right on the back, slightly after it happens. And those are three very, very different feels. The great jazz musicians are constantly moving back and forth across that pulse, being a little bit before it, which sort of projects us forward, or falling back on the beat, which is sort of like a boogie shuffle, a very relaxed feel, or being right in the center, which is very accurate kind of feel. So one of the disagreements in jazz, and I don't mean this from a negative perspective, but each of us will feel that beat in a very different way, and not necessarily all be in the same place at the same time. That can be a very, very creative element in terms of how the band plays together. It can give it a dimension that is almost magical, because you may feel like, wow, it's relaxed, but oops. Now, I mean, it gives it a very conversational element. It's unpredictable, and yet it's always there and it's always moving. So I would say that's one place we could disagree.
Can you tell me a story about a time that you were playing and you had an argument or an interesting conversation happened?
Oh my God. Well, I can tell you something pathological.
Sure, tell me something pathological.
You like that, Dave? I very early in my career, this was in the early '80s. I lived in New York, and I had the great privilege of studying with and playing with a tenor sax player named Warren Marsh. Warren, there's a book on Warren Marsh called The Unsung Cat. Every great jazz player from the 50s through today will recognize that Warren Marsh is still not realized for the greatness that his intellect was, and he is just beginning now to really influence some of the great young players, Mark Turner, Michael Kanan. I mean, we could talk Bill McHenry. So I studied with him, and then he gave me a string of nights working with him at the West End Cafe in New York City, and he put the band together. I'm not really sure how he put the band together, but he paired me with a drummer who was very much different from my style of playing. And we really didn't have much time to rehearse, and I remember the very first night, the very first tune, he looks at me, and he looks at the drummer and the guitar player, and he said, "Whatever happens, just play the tune. Don't try to follow me." This guy his methods of improvisation were so profound that if you tried to follow him, you'd get lost, which is exactly what happened right away, right out of the gate. And he was playing a tune that I knew inside and out, All the Things You Are. And he just, we got lost, and he just kind of stood back and chuckled. And we found ourselves, and we kept going. But later in the night, the drummer, and I'm not naming names, who was a very anxious character, decided that he wanted me to do something stylistically different. So he was playing with brushes. We were playing a very fast tune. And I'm right next to him. I'm standing right next to him. And he leans over, and I'm playing every quarter note. I'm moving. I mean, I was so deep into it. And all of a sudden, he's whacking my arm with his brush. And he's going, pedal, man, pedal. Now, pedal means stop playing every note and just play long tones and just get on the long tone, which stylistically did not go with what Warren was doing. And number one, he crossed a boundary that he shouldn't have crossed. He was physically inside my space, not cool. Number two, he was wrong. I didn't want to do that. The music didn't feel like that. And it was just a total disruption, you know? So there's a disagreement that is completely dysfunctional. But that kind of stuff does happen in jazz because a lot of people who play jazz are doing it for the wrong reasons. And just
what are the wrong reasons? What are the wrong reasons?
Well, probably has a lot to do with their relationship with their mother. I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to get too much deeper into that. But Mingus wrote a tune called Everything You Could Be by Now if Sigmund Freud's mother was your wife. So jazz players are complicated people for sure. That's the kind of disagreement that doesn't work in jazz, and it sure doesn't work in business. But it's based on emotional immaturity, a lack of emotional intelligence, and jazz is rife with it. Business is rife with it. The antidote to it is to be able to listen and to be able to work with whatever is there, rather than decide that you know what it should be and try to make it be something that it may not be. And this is where the idea of leadership in jazz is so profoundly important, because with really great jazz players, the leadership, there is a hierarchy in an ensemble, and we all know who's got the biggest ears, who's got the deepest musical intellect, who's got the most generous portion of nature's musical genius. That's clear. When an ensemble comes together, some people are going to have just a much more powerful and gifted musical intellect than others. And the ones who have less have worked very hard to build their collaborative and musical skills to the point where there's a level of where everybody comes together. So leadership is sort of unspoken in that the ones with the biggest intellects are clearly the leaders. And yet, once the tune begins, the hierarchy is flattened. Everybody is equally responsible for the performance. Great leadership is in the capacity of those with the natural capability to make the others, bring the others up a couple of levels by coming to them rather than expecting the others, to come to their level.
Well, you described two kinds of hierarchy to me so far. I mean, one is the hierarchy of experience and ability. I guess you could say that there are levels of that.
Mhm.
You also described a hierarchy in the kinds of instruments, that some are like there's a rhythm section, and then what would be, I mean, I don't know what the higher levels in that hierarchy would be, but that the rhythm section plays a foundational role, kind of a supporting infrastructure, and then the what would be the leading instruments? What would you call them?
Soloists. They're the
Soloists. Okay.
Yeah, and very few people would look at a jazz ensemble or even a rock band and think of the bass player as the leader. Well,
Right.
the bass player is the leader. And the reason is because they're playing every quarter note. They're the heartbeat of the ensemble. And to the extent that I am able to create these enormous pulses that wrap around the people that I'm playing, not just the individuals, but the entire group, and create this fabric that people feel supported by, comfortable within, the choice of the pitch that I choose has to, one, be open enough so as to give them the structure that they need and not to impinge. So I can't be playing really dissonant notes that don't fit the tune, and yet I've got to be creating enough of an edge so that it gives them something to work with. It gives them a little dissonance to spark their imagination. To me, that's leadership. And it's completely decentralized because it exudes throughout the entire ensemble, and it invites anything to happen. So that's what I meant when I said decentralized leadership. Now,
is that why that situation in the West End Cafe was so disruptive? Because you're the rhythm section. You're supposed to be providing a baseline structure that other people can play around in, and like the other guy who's responsible for creating the platform sort of had a different idea about it than you did.
Well, not only did he have it, it's like he had this idea that wasn't based in the reality of what was happening in the moment. Now, think about that for a second. Any collaboration, you have to work with what's going on in the moment. And yes, if you're going to bring an idea from outside stylistically and say, let's try this. Well, okay, when the tune finishes and we've got a minute to talk before the next tune starts, you say, hey, in that last tune, I really heard a section where you might have pedaled the note instead of playing every quarter note. Why don't we try that the next time we get up to something that's a fast tempo? Great idea. But to try to bring that in the moment when the thing is going down and it's happening, and our market is sitting right there in front of us, our audience, and we are, providing the back and forth dynamic. No, that was just totally dysfunctional.
So what do you do in a case situation
okay,
like that?
What I did, I stopped playing. I just stopped playing, and I looked at the guy, and I just stopped playing. And at that point, the guitar player was taking his solo, so Warren Marsh was not playing. He was watching us, and he just started chuckling. He just started chuckling. I mean, this guy was so far beyond. He saw what was going on. He didn't care. I mean, this guy would get up in the morning or in the afternoon, put his horn in his mouth, and it didn't stop until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and then it started again the same way the next day, and that was it until he was 57 years old, and he died right in the middle of an improvisation on stage. So,
Wow.
But the other thing I was saying about leadership is in jazz, it's also distributed, which means that each of us do get the chance to solo, which is a very, very important idea because it puts every one of us in the position of understanding the responsibility of leadership. And that resonates into all sorts of directions. From my point of view as a bass player, soloing has taught me the critical importance of time and the expression of time, the importance of simplicity, the elegance of simplicity, the accessibility of simplicity, both from the ensemble's perspective and from the audience's, the market's perspective.
Well, that's I want to unpack a couple of those things you just said now.
Sure.
Simplicity, the importance of simplicity. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine music more complex than jazz. And yet, you talk about the importance of simplicity. Can you tell me what you mean by that? I mean, is that sort of what you were getting at when you said getting down to the metronome, getting down to the beat?
Yes. When all is said and done, after we've put in the 10,000 hours to learn the instrument, all the theoretical stuff we got to learn, the scales, the chords, the tunes, all the gigs you got to play, what you're practicing is connecting with the pulse. And that translates to the ability to communicate clearly and in a very deeply engaged fashion with the people you're playing with and ultimately with your audience, your market. There's a lot of complexity in jazz. The jazz that transcends time, it's not so much that it's simple, but in its elements, it is simple in that the rhythm is clear, it's economical. When it swings like crazy, even somebody who doesn't know the first thing about jazz can't feel still. They have to move with it. And that's because the physics of the way we're relating to the pulse is something that really goes beyond music. It's something that creates an excitement. And it's very clear. The propulsion, I'm not setting up disruption. I'm not trying to trick you. I'm not trying to take you in one direction and then leave you there and surprise you and lose you. I'm swinging. It's an embrace of life, a celebration.
That leads into what you were saying about time, because I mean, you talked about time being important, and of course, everything that we experience happens in time.
Mm-hmm.
And just about every activity that people have to coordinate on, whether it's a party or a business activity or music, requires them to be in a moment, in those moments together, to synchronize. Everything has a rhythm, right? Even the seasons of the year have a rhythm. The work has a rhythm. And so one of the things that people, I think some people struggle with, is this idea, especially in business, if we're going to let people make their own time and make their own rhythm, we're going to lose a lot of the ability to predict what we want to be able to predict. And so when is something going to be accomplished, or what's going to get done in this time frame? Can you talk a little bit about what you've learned about time and timing? I mean, I think there's something very powerful in the idea that when you walk into a situation, I mean, even if there's a rhythm that's wrong, let's just say there's a rhythm that's wrong. Actually, can you think of a time when you did feel that the rhythm was wrong and it needed some help moving to a different place?
Let me reframe that, because I think that's a really good point. It's not so much that the rhythms are wrong as there is a real diversity in the different rhythmic fields. When the structure that we're using is overly complex, it means that that diversity of rhythmic approaches will have a harder time integrating with each other. So to get back to the idea of simplification, and I'm thinking of a performance I just did last week in Orlando with a terrific piano player, Michael Kanan. And the band had never played together before. We were all great musicians, but we had to pull the thing together the night before. And Michael took some of the tunes that I had chosen, and he looked at the chord structure, and he said, whoa, this is way too complex. We can simplify this. Where you've got 4 different harmonic changes happening in these 2 measures, we can just make this one harmonic change. Really, that's okay. That simplification opened up the platform that we were using so that the very different rhythmic approaches, the different timing that each person brought to it, was all of a sudden able to flow together in a productive way, versus one where there had been constant conflict because each person was trying to negotiate the complexity in their own way. By simplifying that structure, all of a sudden we each had tremendous freedom to do it the way we needed to do it, but also to do it together and get done what needed to be done, which was to play the tune so that people could understand and appreciate it.
So that's a case where there was conflict, but it was coming out of an overly complex support structure.
Yes.
And as soon as you simplified the support structure, the conflict was reduced or went away?
It was reduced, but that in conjunction with the idea that each of us, regardless of our roles, has a sort of cross-functional understanding of what the other person does. So once you reduce the structure, if there's that cross-functional capability or a cross-functional awareness, even if I mean, obviously I'm not going to be able to play the piano on my bass, and yet I have enough of a cross-functional understanding of what Mike is doing so that I'm able to really appreciate that. Once that structure is opened up, that cross-functional understanding becomes very, very important. And I think that's another organizational dynamic that a good jazz ensemble has that is really starting to surface in companies like Zappos or Whole Foods, who are really starting to think about structure and hierarchy in a very different way.
Yeah, well, so we've talked a little bit about conflict. You started down a track of getting lost I think that's also an very interesting thread. I wouldn't mind picking up and following a little bit more.
Hmm.
What do you do? Yeah, what do you? Let's say you're in a collaboration that does feel like it's going well, and it's complex or whatever, but you're feeling lost. Can you tell me a story about when you felt lost in a collaboration like that, and what you did about it, how it ended up?
Well, well, if what we're doing is playing a tune, because there are different types of improvisation, but if we've started the piece and it's agreed that we're playing a tune, let's say Bye Bye Blackbird, and all of a sudden I'm lost, that's unacceptable. That means I don't know the tune. And just as in a business situation, if you come into the table and you're going to play the tune, you've got to be accountable for it. That's very different from a situation that I often use in some of my seminars, which I call free play, in which we will ask the audience for 3 notes, and then I will use a timer. And using the 3 notes that the audience gives us, and a timer using the structure of 3 minutes, we will, as an ensemble, create a piece of music. Now, that is a position where you intentionally start from absolute uncertainty, except for the fact that you know you've got these 3 notes to hold on to. What happens in that situation is a very interesting exercise, because for it to ultimately work, we have to each listen to each other more than we're listening to ourselves. We have to listen, we have to get beyond ourselves, listen to the whole, try to understand what is emerging spontaneously. Clearly, we're not going to create some, typical jazz piece of music, but more often than not, we end up creating a very interesting, sometimes the most interesting piece of music in the program, because we don't know where it's going to go, and it really is pure. It's a microcosm of the innovative process, and when it works well, everybody is really outside of their own interests and working to support the whole. And there's a very high degree of respect for silence, for the economy of your ideas, and for trying to make it fit in the pressure of this time frame that we have, which is 3 minutes. So I would say that's the most interesting instance of being lost, and yet at the same time not being lost, being lost and not being lost at the same
It sounds
time.
like almost sounds like you're intentionally getting lost. You're saying, okay, we're gonna inject some random. We're gonna start with some completely random things, and we're going to start to put some like a selection time pressure on it, like the 3-minute pressure. So those are constraints. I mean, those are things that, as a designer, I think about all the time. It's got to be black and white. It's got to work it's got to be a computer icon. It's got to work at this size.
Absolutely.
You have these colors or whatever. So that, I mean, constraints. The idea that constraints can drive creativity is a great one. I was sort of, I mean, you did mention you were with Warren Marsh, and he said, "Don't try to follow me."
Mm.
And you did talk about being lost, and it wasn't about not understanding the tune, though, right? I mean,
No, it was about trying to follow his design um, too directly.
mm,
Uh, and I also, I was young and fairly inexperienced, and he knew that. He liked the feeling behind my baseline, which is why I'm assuming he hired me. But
Mhm.
he also had enough wisdom to know that if I tried to follow his logic, I was going to get lost rapidly because he really was on a much, much higher plane. So he wasn't saying it in any kind of a condescending way.
No, I understand that. I
Yeah,
understand that.
yeah,
But there was an I mean, but there, but I also understood you to say, well, we tried anyway, and we did get lost.
yeah,
Or, even though he said that, he probably knew you would.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. Uh,
so why? I mean, it was just curiosity. Trying to.
well,
Is it a way of trying to understand the logic?
yes,
Um,
and in getting lost in that first tune, first of all, I mean, there I am on this great stage in New York with one of the great improvisers of all time. You better believe I was sweating bullets. I mean, I'm what, 20 years old, something like that. And getting lost was important because it showed me what I needed to do for the rest of the night to provide exactly what was needed from my particular role. And that didn't mean that I couldn't explore and I couldn't improvise, but it meant that, where I was used to like really working with most horn players my age and, understanding where they were going, it meant, oh no, you are swimming in the deep end, much deeper than you've ever been before. And you need to pay attention to dog paddle right now, and
Got it.
let Warren do what he wants to do.
Well, that gets back to what you were saying about trust and really taking responsibility. As part of what I hear you're saying is you've got to take responsibility for your level of expertise on something. You've got to take responsibility for um, a lot.
Well, the issue is trust. The issue is trust. If you trust yourself in the time, that's when it's going to feel good. And if it feels good at that level, then you know the other people you're playing with are going to feel that, and they're going to feel good. If you don't trust yourself with the time, you can't really. There's nowhere to go from there. It's got to start with the trust that you have in your own capacity. Um,
Well, so here's I mean the big notes that I've taken down here are, and I'm gonna be interested in if you feel like this I'm missing something important. I probably am missing a lot, but one
yeah,
is about trust and one. Well, actually, so one is about the sort of the birthplace of where this stuff sort of has come from originally, which is whether you call it a clash or a melding, is this these different traditions that one of which was very structural and precise, and one of which was very improvisational, and the coming together of those is where something really innovative, creative, and powerful happened. Another is that leadership is decentralized and distributed in a jazz ensemble, and yet even though leadership is distributed and decentralized, there are hierarchies at play. Hierarchies in terms of the level of expertise that people had. You just talked about Warren Marsh and being swimming in the deep end, but also hierarchies of sort of a structure. Sort of certain roles are better positioned or better placed in a kind of supporting role, or certain instruments, what have you. But also having to have that relatively some understanding of what the other people are doing and what they're trying to do. You mentioned timing, and rhythm a lot, and being able to be not disrupt a moment, but to take what is there and always recognize what's there and be listening to that, and then contribute to it in whatever way you can, and simplicity. Is there anything there that you really feel is a hole that I'm missing?
No, no. This is a very interesting conversation.
So
But
back to the idea of agility then.
yeah, that's what I was
Um,
going to say.
yeah, go.
I think what we're talking about and all these different things are conditions that have to be um, recognized, considered, um, practiced in order for agility to be a quality that is constant. Um, and uh, Practicing agility um, is a very difficult thing to do when you're a newbie, when you're just learning. There's so much that you have to learn. Um, but once you've reached a certain level of expertise, uh, being aware of those conditions that we've just discussed over the past hour um, is critical to understanding what agility means. Um, I think agility is a frame of mind that depends on the chemistry of who you're with, the circumstances under which you're functioning. Uh, Duke Ellington said, every night is an adjustment to the sound of the venue that you're playing in. The band can sound terrific in a recording studio, but the fact of the matter is you're going to be in a different environment every night, and the agility with which you are able to adjust to that makes or breaks everything about that performance. Um, and then it breaks down into the various sub levels and how you're able to relate uh, to the individuals you're playing with, and then how you relate to yourself. Um, if we are able to be agile with ourselves, then we're going to start to be agile with the people that we're working with. But I think it's internal first.
And have you? How does this compare when you compare the work that you've done in the music world with the stuff that you've done in jobs, like day jobs or work business type stuff? Um, when have you found that? I mean, have you? Can you tell me about times when agility was just the wrong thing? When it was just like you tried to be agile and it was just absolutely the wrong thing for the situation?
Yeah,
Or times when it was just absolutely the right thing that was needed?
well, I feel that in any situation where um, a person is either behaving unethically, uh, say in a business regard, or is clearly working to subvert people's capabilities and the capability of the group to work together. You may need agility in terms of being able to handle the damage that's being done, but agility really isn't an element that you can start to think about until you remove that person or remove yourself. Um, the same thing in a jazz ensemble. If I'm working with somebody who just clearly should not be there, is not ready to be there, or is hostile, in the case of that drummer I told you about, it's agility is not an issue. Agility is kind of the final layer that exists between people who have the capacity to make something innovative work together. And
Well, you just described something. I think you just hit on something that I do think is maybe was missing in what I said earlier, which is um, it sounds like it's very, very important that you not only have awareness of um, the situation and the other people who are in the situation, but awareness of yourself, self-awareness. and a ability to assess your, like you said, if you're out of your depth, that's probably okay if you know it.
Yes.
But if you're out of your depth and you don't know it, there is a phenomenon that the less you actually understand something, the more confident you are that you do understand it. It was like there's a really funny John Cleese video where he talks about, if you're really, really stupid, then you're actually too stupid to know how stupid you are. And so there's this point at which you're, someone who maybe, and I think that probably that's maybe one of the most important first steps. And then when you describe someone who's actively trying to change a situation, they either don't understand themselves, or they're not understanding the situation, or probably in the case of your drummer, a little bit of both, can be a dangerous thing. And I think that's something I've heard from a lot of people that I've spoken to is, it's not a problem to be out of your depth. It's a problem to be closed about your process, to not let people even, and I've heard some stories even when people were really expert at something, really good at something, but were unable to share that process. Not being able to function in more agile teams because they required trust of other people.
Mm-hmm.
Trust me, I know this, I'm the specialist, but they didn't trust those people enough to, here, let me show you how I do this. There was a case of a guy in a team that was basically everyone hated him and he knew it, and but they felt like they needed him, and so he was unable to. He had the feeling that if he taught people how to do what he knew, that he would be out of there.
Wow.
And the fact was, what ended up happening was, even though they felt like they really couldn't do without him, he was out of there anyway.
Yeah, because
it was like that drummer you were talking about. They were unable to function without removing him from the situation. It was. And this comes up in painting. When you're doing a painting, you often will fall in love with a part of the painting which maybe it's beautiful, but it's in the wrong place, or it's too small, and Picasso famously said, just destroy those things immediately. So if you start falling in love with a piece of something, just destroy it immediately, because it's going to ruin your concept of the whole.
That is so deep. Oh man.
But I think that's sort of the similar kind of thing with the team, is that if one person is unable to be flexible or unable to become self-aware or whatever, then sometimes people will have to go, or sometimes you'll have to find another place.
It astounds me that this, it's so simple and obvious that agility and trust can't exist without each other. Why are we not dumping huge amounts of resources into finding ways to develop agility and trust, not only in business, but in all organizations?
Yeah, I'm afraid there's a lot of organizations whose concept of trust is sort of like the concept of how you manage prisoners in a prison. Well, we trust them to stay in their cages because there's cages and there's guards, and we trust them. So this is the we put guidelines and rules and processes and procedures in place to make things more predictable, but what ends up happening is we're sending a pretty consistent message to people that we don't trust them.
Have you watched Orange is the New Black? Have you seen
I haven't. I have not. I've heard a lot about it, though.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in there about trust.
Okay.
That's an interesting paradigm. But
Well, we're running out of time. I do want to ask you one final question.
Sure.
What else? What else would you? What else have I? What have I not asked you about that you'd like to hit on, or what are some final thoughts that you'd like to share, if anything?
Uh, well, God, I don't know. I mean, it's been such a stimulating conversation. Um, I think if we talk again, to dive a little deeper into the process of innovation and what it means, uh, how uh, how it actually works, how one of the things that's occurred to me over and over again in the world of jazz is that the minute a record is made and it fixes the process in a way that stops, that becomes an obstacle to the innovative process. So if you look at Kind of Blue, Miles Davis made that record in the late 50s.
I love that record.
It's an incredibly beautiful record, and the band, you know, I mean, is as stellar as it gets. John Coltrane, Cannonball, Philly Joe. Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing record, and yet that stopped his innovation process because it was so successful that for him to continue, he literally had to create himself all over again. And I think I mentioned this article in the New Yorker by Jill Lepore, which really takes Christensen to task on his book, The Innovator's Dilemma. And in it, she talks about Joseph Schumpeter, who in 1939 started talking about creative destruction. That, I think, really has to be unwrapped. I don't think we understand what that really means, and I think that Jill Lepore makes a very good point in thinking about disruptive innovation as something that is a given and that we need to expect, and to just be running with it as this concept is very, very dangerous. Because all of the things that we just talked about are critical if disruptive innovation is going to do anything constructive rather than just disruptive. And yet, nobody's really talking about these things, So I think if we were to talk more, I would want to talk about that.
Yeah, especially maybe how we get that more innovative about the way that we work together.
Totally.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Once again, my name is Dave Gray. I'm working on a book called Principles of Agility. I've been talking with Michael Gold of Jazz Impact. You can find him at jazz-impact.com, right?
That's it.
Well, thanks so much, Michael. It's really been great to talk to you today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Dave. Anytime. Thank you.